Well, really terrific to be with you here this morning and to work with you, talk with you, share with you from this final section that we'll be looking at of Jacob's life. I hope you've kind of enjoyed this journey with Jacob. He's a gloriously flawed individual, and I think that just makes him all the more relatable, and even more important, of course, than that, the God who works in him and through him as very close and near to flawed individuals like me and you. We're going to get into Jacob this morning and this particular passage by looking at the question of identity and the issue of who I am and how I take my place in the world relative to others. It is one of the great preoccupations of our culture, isn't it? Whether that's on the sort of somewhat negative side of what's come to be called identity politics, where public figures seek to weaponise the different identity markers that define people, or the much more sort of personal and particular issues of value and worth and self-esteem. This question of identity, how to respond to the challenge of forging a stable identity that means you can have meaningful and substantial relationships and endeavours in life, it really is a fundamental part of what it is to be an adult these days. And I think one of the kind of consequences of that, a little bit surprising actually, is that identity has become hard work. It's something that you have to reflect upon, it's something that you have to choose, and then it's something that you have to perform, and especially perform it on social media, that great self-defining tool. Now, of course, that used not to be so, at least not with its current intensity. For generations in traditional cultures, identity really was not a choice. It wasn't even really a matter of reflection or worry. It was just a given. You had a station in life, a family, a village, a role. It was set by society, and that was just your identity, fairly simply. There wasn't much you could do about it. There wasn't much you needed to do about it. Just conform to your role. At the same time, there's more similarity than might at first glance be apparent between traditional cultures and their conformity-based approach to identity and our more modern society and its performance-based approach to identity. And the thing that they have in common is both are hard work. Both are hard work. Both have fundamentally to do with summoning up the energy and commitment to making things work, whether by conforming or performing. And what I want to draw out from this remarkable passage this morning is that the Bible has a very different approach to the question of identity altogether. And we really do see it here in beautiful, powerful form in this key moment in the life of Jacob. Because what we see here is that this is a new day for him. Jacob has been dealing with God all along. But this is the day in which he's really a truly changed person. This is the absolutely radically life-transforming encounter with God, which culminates in a renaming of Jacob. Literally, a new identity. It's one of those lovely things from the past that we've mostly lost. Often in Scripture, names aren't just sort of monikers that we put on things. Names have meaning and significance, and we've seen that with Jacob. Literally, his name means grasper, wrangler, supplanter, grappler. That's the kind of person he is. His name speaks of who he is in his depths. And in chapter 32, verse 28, he is given a new name. And as such is given a new identity, a new security, a new destiny. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. Ultimately the father of the 12 tribes that constitute Israel. And as we walk with Jacob through this moment, we'll see that there are three things that go into this kind of profound renaming of Jacob to become Israel. God meets Jacob when Jacob is alone. Jacob meets God at the centre, and Jacob meets God in weakness. So first, Jacob meets God alone. Pick it up at verse 22. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, likewise everything that he had, and Jacob was left alone. It's quite emphatic, isn't it? Jacob was left alone. Now, if you've been with us over these last few weeks and following the story, you'll know how we got here. Jacob has been true to his name. He has supplanted his elder twin brother Esau with the help of his really, really unwise mother. It has destroyed their family. And Esau's response to being swindled out of his birthright and his blessing is murderous rage. And so Jacob flees to escape his brother's wrath, 1,000 kilometres away. But now, after 20 years, he's coming back to his family home. He left penniless. He now returns with enormous wealth. He's coming back, and he hears that Esau is on his way toward him, if you read earlier in the story, with 400 men. It just happens that 400 men is the standard size of a military company. Esau's coming. 400 of his best buddies with him. And Jacob is, understandably, terrified. Surely, 400, it's not an accident, it's not 399. It's military. We're going to be attacked. And so Jacob divides up his entourage, this huge kind of collection of people and goods and chattels that he's got with him, his servants and his livestock, and he sends them ahead of himself in waves. Each wave is going to get to Esau first, and the servants are instructed to lavish kingly presents of all sorts on Esau as a way of kind of mollifying and persuading and turning his heart toward Jacob. Esau comes upon the first bunch, there's 5 of them. Oh, great Esau, King, Lord, please accept this gift from Jacob. And he said, oh, thanks very much. And he moves on, and there's another group. Oh my goodness, who's this? Another group, oh, please accept these. More camels. I mean, how many camels can one person have? And it's 5 wave after wave. And now it's the night before the next day. And that next day is when Esau will finally reach Jacob. And Jacob is unsure as to what's happened to anyone that he's sent before. For all he knows, they've just all been killed. He's put everyone in front of him except his immediate family, and tomorrow he meets Esau. Tomorrow is for him the day of crisis. And so what does Jacob do the night before the day of crisis? He ensures that he's alone. It makes sense. He wants to think, to reflect, to pray. And we see at the start of this chapter that he's already begun to pray, but now in the darkness he meets God in a profoundly personal and transformative way. He's alone. Now, I just want to pause on that. I think there's something really important here. We are rightly aware in our culture of the danger and, frankly, impossibility of extreme individualism, as though any person can make their way throughout life without others in community. Okay, individualism doesn't work and can't work. We're just not built like that. And that's fundamental to the Christian life as well. To be a child of the Heavenly Father just is to be a sister or brother to others as well. We are one holy, universal and apostolic church with all the saints throughout the ages, and there just is no other way to be a Christian. That's all true. And at the same time, it's possible to let the community reality of life and faith become the dominant reality, especially where the community reality is a relatively positive one, where it's not merely a Sunday experience, but one of an actual community that functions and supports and connects. It's possible to let the community reality of life and faith become the dominant reality so that your primary experience of God ends up being the experience of the community. When it's good, you're good. When it's cold and dull, you're spiritually cold and dull as well. But what we see here with Jacob right at the start is that you have to meet God alone. You have to meet God yourself. You cannot live off what other people do and say and find yourself with a kind of second-hand faith experiencing other people's experiences of God. And my guess is that we have a lot of ground to make up here. Solitude, being alone with God, doing real, long, deep business with Him in quiet moments in life is not a long suit for many of us. And there's nothing much in our culture that would encourage it. After all, there's always some more doom scrolling to do. But right off the bat, we have to be alone with God to be transformed by Him. Because when you're alone with God, that you meet Him right at the centre of your life. Point 2. One of the most interesting things about this whole incident is that it is, strictly speaking, it's actually unnecessary. On the one hand, the reason that Jacob is here is because he's obedient to God. At the start of the previous chapter, chapter 31, it's the Lord who says to him, "Return to the land of your ancestors and to your kindred, and I will be with you." So God says, "Go home," and Jacob says, "Okay." On the other hand, meeting Esau was not a geographical necessity. Esau had settled, we read, quote, "in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, which is miles to the south." Jacob could easily have just skirted north of Esau and gone home, and Esau would be none the wiser. In other words, what we have here is that Jacob voluntarily makes sure that he meets Esau. He knew that to be right with God, to be in the right with God, obedient to Him, he also needed to be right with his brother, and therefore he sends messages to Esau, even though he knows that it might cost him his life. And the night before the fateful meeting, he's alone with God, and God does something remarkable. Verse 24, "And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him in the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for the day is breaking.' But Jacob said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.'" Now we need to slow this down and see the details and the moves here in this astonishing moment. First, reflect on the fact that God beats up Jacob. He fights with Jacob. The reality that this is God wrestling with Jacob is held back from us. Initially, we're simply told that a man wrestled with Jacob until daybreak. Again, just make sure you enter the situation imaginatively. Don't just let it sort of slide over the top of you. What, daybreak? 6, 7, maybe hours? I used to wrestle with, mates. And 6 or 7 seconds was enough for me. 6 or 7 minutes would see me kind of exhausted. 6 or 7 hours, Jacob wrestles till daybreak. Think of the physical exertion and exhaustion. And it turns out that Jacob can hold his own against this man. Jacob really is Jacob. He's a scrapper. He's a grasper. However, as sunrise approaches, the man decides it's time to finish things, and so he touches Jacob on the hip and puts his hip socket out of joint, maiming Jacob. Now, for those that are under a certain age, this doesn't really, touch you, really. But as I've gotten a little older and hips, just don't work quite as well as I really feel for Jacob at this point. And what's so interesting is that Jacob's now maimed. All night they've wrestled each other to a standstill. All night they've been going hard at it, and it's a draw. But now it turns out that the man could have won at any time with only a touch, just ding. And here's the turning point. Because notice what happens next? Think about it for a moment. When someone attacks you, why are you wrestling with them? What's your end point? What's your goal in wrestling with someone who's attacking with you in the middle of the night? Either you want to sort of resist them so forcefully that they run away, or you want to sort of get them on the so that you can run away, right? That's the idea. If someone's attacking you, just get away from them. But look at verse 26. Jacob says, actually, on the contrary, I will not let you go. Jacob has changed his wrestling. Now he knows who it is, precisely because this is someone who can maim him with a single touch. This is the moment when he sort of figures who it is that he's dealing with. And it's at that moment that Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go. I need you. I want you to stay in my life. And that happens at the moment of pain, at the moment of weakness, at the moment that he realized that he's utterly vulnerable and defenseless. There is something, I think, profoundly important here, redemptive even. It's a little dangerous, but this is a God who says, I want to bless you. I want to change your life. I want to wake you up to who you really are and to who I really am. I want you to see the foolish things you've been doing in your life, and almost the only way I can get you into that is that I'm going to have to wrestle with you. I can't comfort you into your new identity because that's just not how it works. One commentator put it like this: God becomes, out of love, the enemy of your old self, the self that's not built on God, and brings you into weakness so you can wake up and begin to grow in your new self. God wrestles with Jacob. It's an astonishing thing, and he hurts him for his good. Which leads to the second thing to notice. In the Hebrew, there is a delicious irony in verse 24. It's translated, a man wrestled with Jacob until daybreak, but literally it says, a man came and Jacobed with him. The word Jacob just is the word for wrestle, and so God comes to Jacob and Jacobs him, meets him because the name is his reality, meets him right at the core of his being. Someone finally out-Jacobs Jacob. The reason that Jacob's name is wrestle is because that's his life. He's a wrestler, he's a grasper, he's someone who's always trying to get the upper hand and jockey for position and get the advantage and obtain and attain. That's his nature. That's his center. And that's why for God to deal with Jacob, he has to wrestle him. He has to Jacob him. He has to get right to his core. But that kind of leads to the next question, which is with whom has Jacob been wrestling all his life? And if you ask Jacob, I think, be pretty clear on what the answer would be. The thing he's been wrestling with all his life is with Esau, which is his problem tomorrow, right? What Jacob says is, all my life I've had to wrestle with Esau. I wrestled with him in my mother's womb. I wrestled with him for the birthright. I wrestled with him for my father's blessing. Esau has been the problem with my life. He's the one who stood between me and the life that I've wanted. And what happens is that in the middle of the night, this mysterious figure comes in and begins to wrestle with Jacob. And that's God saying to him, you foolish one. I'm the one that you've been wrestling with all your life. Do you see how this moment becomes a kind of a parable in just one evening of his entire life? I'm the one that you've been wrestling with all your life. You thought that tomorrow was the big moment. No. Tonight is. The problem beneath all of your problems has been that you've been wrestling with me, resisting me, fighting with me, constructing your life and yourself on your own, grasping and clutching and clawing, and it hasn't worked. It's made a mess of things all your life. Nothing less than a new identity is needed for you. And so I need to get right to the core of your being. I have to wrestle that out of you so that you can become Israel. So on the one hand, one of the themes of Jacob's life is this wrestling, but the final thing to notice is the blessing. Jacob hangs on for grim life to the man he's wrestling with and won't let him go until he's blessed. And that's always been Jacob's defining characteristic, hasn't it? He's been grasping after blessing, duping Esau with the lentil stew, fooling his frail old father, winning the beautiful Rachel, outmaneuvering Laban, his father-in-law. It's always been about blessing for Jacob. And none of it has worked. None of it has really satisfied him. None of it can fill the void that is at the centre of his soul and constitute a solid identity and sense of self. Only this moment will. And so Jacob moves into reverse wrestling and he refuses to let his opponent go until verse 29, and there he blessed him. Finally, Jacob receives the blessing that he has been wrangling for all his life. But now he looks for it in the right place, in the living and true God who reconstitutes him and then therefore renames him. He becomes Israel, a new name for a new identity, a name which literally means God fights. And even in that name, don't you think there's something of a double meaning? God fights against Jacob, but only because God fights for Jacob so that he can become Israel. So it's point 3. See, the most astonishing thing about this incident is that Jacob could hold his own in a wrestling match with God. Don't you think that's kind of a little bit weird? Jacob says his opponent has striven with God and humans. Now, we know that he's striven with humans and prevailed. He's wangled and wrangled his way through, beating all of his father and his brother and Laban, and he's really very, very successful. He's made a misery of his life in becoming so. He's striven with humans and prevailed. Big deal. And now he's striven with God and prevailed. And that is remarkable. How can that be? Well, let me give you a story, see if it can help. When my kids were young, we used to play a game that they called Jump on Daddy. I'd be sitting on the couch, minding my own business, doing important work like watching the golf, and one of them would decide that it was just too boring and it was time to jazz things up, and so they would literally jump me. I wouldn't even know it was coming. They would just launch. All three would grab me and jump up and down on my head and generally rumble with me. Now, I was neither fit nor strong. I was a middle-aged man with 3 kids. But then they were all under 10, so they were all much smaller than me. And actually, when you're not very fit and strong and a middle-aged man, you get bigger as they're not, And so the point was that it was no fun if I just crawled up in a ball and didn't fight back. But at the same time, if I let my rock-solid 100-kilogram frame go all out, that might be just a little bit dangerous for these, 2 and 4 and 7-year-olds. So I had to take my weight off them as we wrestled. They could use their whole weight to jump on my head but I couldn't. The whole deal is that I had to make myself weak. And I wonder whether that's something of what we see here. God makes himself weak so that he fails to overpower Jacob. He didn't fail, but he did fail. You see, if he'd won, if he had crushed Jacob in the wrestle, he wouldn't have gotten what he really wanted, because what God always wants is a changed heart, a changed life, an awakening. And so God fails in the wrestling match. He loses in order to win. If he'd won, he would have lost Jacob. But because he lost, he won. And of course, as soon as you put it like that, you hear that, you kind of can't help but see the ultimate moment where God won through losing, where he triumphs through defeat. On the cross, Jesus wrestled. Except what did Jesus wrestle with? Jesus wrestled with the full weight. Jacob didn't get the full weight of God. My kids didn't get the full weight of God. God took most of the full weight of me, rather. God took most of his weight off Jacob, made himself weak, so that all Jacob got was a blow that woke him up and didn't destroy him. But on the cross, Jesus Christ goes into our place and he takes the full weight of God. The full weight, the omnipotence, the justice, the holiness. And he holds on. And he says, I won't let go. Not until they get the blessing. Us. What's happening on the cross is that Jesus takes the curse of the law which we break in order to get the blessing for us. Do you see? Jesus becomes the ultimate Jacob, who takes the full weight, the devastating blows of justice and holiness, so that we only get the blows of love that wake us up. Jesus gets the full weight of omnipotence and justice, so all we get are the bearable blows of love and grace that will bring us to ourselves. And it's as we see this weakness in God, the weakness of the cross, a God who becomes weak for me, will that be the kind of spiritual power, a grace that really does change us, really does melt us, that moves us from just knowing about God to actually having a profound and life-changing encounter with God, where you get renamed. Let's draw these threads together. You may recall that back in chapter 28, when Jacob has the dream about the angels ascending and descending on the ladder, we read that the sun had set. And now finally, after 20 long years, 20 years of grasping and striving, directly after and because of his encounter with the living and true God, we read in chapter 32, verse 31, the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel. But notice how it finishes, limping because of his hip. He's been touched by God. The sun rises on Jacob's life, but he now lives with a limp. And they go together in God's economy. Power is made perfect in weakness. God's grace is sufficient for us precisely with the thorn in the flesh. One author put the paradox like this: the blessed man carries two new distinctives, a new name and a new crippling. And that's the point. The new name cannot be separated from the new crippling, for the crippling is the substance of the name. Jacob became Israel when he came to the end of himself. His weakness birthed strength. His defeat wrought victory. his end was the beginning. And so I want to invite you over the course of the day to a reflection exercise, actually. I remember one of the really most interesting books I ever read at high school in English, and tragically there weren't enough of them, but this one was. It's called A Wizard of Earthsea, and it introduced me to this idea that names could mean things, by a remarkable author, Ursula Le Guin. And I wonder whether what we might do as a result of this remarkable changing of Jacob to Esau is to reflect on what might your names be. Your old name and your new name. Not necessarily what's on your birth certificate, although in my case, my parents put my name as Andrew. That comes from the Latin word aner, which means, I think unsurprisingly, manly. Maybe more hopeful than prophetic, but there you go. All of us perhaps might be able to take up the idea of a name like Jacob. I think all of us grasp to some degree and wrangle and try and wrestle our way into making things work in our lives. And all of us need the name Jacob sort of moved out of it. But what would be a name that captures how you do life when you're not resting on all that God is and does for you? And what might be a new name? Your Christian name. We used to do this actually in baptism. You get a new name. What might be a new name? It's quite an interesting exercise, actually. I've been mulling on this all week, and I know others have said, and someone said to me, actually, I probably need help from other people. So if you're feeling extremely brave, why don't you ask someone else what they might say is your name that captures you? And then go on and ask yourself the question, where might you have been living in your old name rather than your new name, your old identity rather than the you that God has made you in Christ? Because it may be that you feel that God has been wrestling with you. You feel his blows. You feel his hand upon you. You feel that life has become a bit dislocated, like a hip out of joint. And the call of the text this morning is to learn from Jacob's journey. The blows of God are never because he has anything but love and destiny for you. As the great hymn, How Firm a Foundation, puts it in, I think it's the 3rd verse, when through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flames shall not hurt thee, my only design, thy dross to consume, thy gold to refine. Amen.